Hello, and welcome to Friends for Life, a podcast of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod's National Mission. We're here to come alongside you as we journey through life under the cross. What does it look like to care for our neighbors in body and soul? How do we tend to our own body and soul? How can we speak up for life? And finally, how do we share the faith with the next generation? Join us as we have these conversations and learn together. We hope you'll stick around and be our friends for life.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Steph, here with my guest, Pastor Scott Heitshusen. Pastor, welcome. Would you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Absolutely, be happy to. My name is Scott Heitshusen. I am the pastor at LifeBridge Community Lutheran Church in Sealy, Texas. That's about 40 miles west of Houston. I've served 3 previous congregations, St. Mark in Houston, Spring Branch area, Athens, Georgia at Trinity, and at Trinity downtown in Orlando, Florida. I've been serving about 28 years and just happy to be with you today.
Well, wonderful. It's good to have you. We have a lot to cover, so let's get started. But first, I want to know, because this season we are focusing on the issue of human trafficking. And I'm curious, how did you, Pastor, become aware of this issue and involved in this issue?
Yeah, it was back, I want to say around 2012. I was at a meeting with some other pastors in the area, and there's a district representative. And one of the fellow pastors who was there, Pastor Tim Niekirk of Salem Lutheran in Tomball, tremendous guy, great pastor. He was handing out audio CDs because, this was several years ago, but it was audio CDs. Yeah, exactly. To all the participants. And on it was a talk by a Benji Nolo called Rebuke the Oppressor. And he was given a talk about human trafficking. Benji Nolo actually went on to write and direct one of the definitive documentaries on human trafficking called Nefarious Merchant of Souls. And then he did a later one as well. But he's quite well known. But this talk, I remember listening to it in my car, and it broke me. I had no idea this was going on. And of course, this was before most people knew trafficking was going on. And I even remember the place I was when that finished, and I had conflicting feelings of anger, of sadness, of not knowing what steps to take, of not knowing what to do. And from there, I started looking at what are some things to do, what are some ways that I can help in this. And I think, good or bad, being in the Houston area, which is a hub of trafficking, there was plenty of opportunities to get involved.
What do you think our listeners, and myself included as I'm listening to you today, what should we know as we begin this conversation together about human trafficking as a kind of a baseline knowledge? What do you want our listeners to know about human trafficking before we begin?
I think it's just so much more pervasive than people imagine. The fact is that your listeners, either they or a loved one has almost certainly been at least peripherally affected, if not directly, and maybe not even knowing, going by places or, so much is online now. I mean, it is just pervasive in so many aspects. And because it is so extremely multifaceted, there's so many arteries that come in and out of this issue that it's nearly impossible not to have been affected in one way or the other. So it's likely around you in some way, shape, or form right now, and that's even in rural areas, and that's because so much of it is online as well. But it's just everywhere, and it's grown so much since COVID. It was really bad before, and it's so much more worse now.
Well, you mentioned that it's so much more pervasive than people imagine. And even in rural areas, which I would consider probably the area where I live in Northeast Arkansas more rural, certainly than urban. And I have to confess that I thought of human trafficking as an issue that was some kind of thing that happened far away, or overseas, or in poorer third world countries. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago when I was at just a regular MOPS meeting in Jonesboro, Arkansas, not a very largely populated city, where we had a speaker come in and talk to us about human trafficking in our area. And I had no idea that
Yeah.
even in a place like where I live, that it was an issue. And they shared about the different signs of, where we could recognize it possibly happening, the different venues in which human trafficking more likely would take place in our area. It was eye-opening. And so I think it's important to highlight for our listeners that human trafficking is increasing in the U.S. So domestically, it's a domestic issue, not just something far away.
Yes, absolutely.
And then also the awareness, it's been in the news much more recently, and some celebrities that have been caught in human trafficking schemes, which is just terrible. But whether it's within our borders or across our borders, why should we as American Christians be aware of this issue and then also committed to helping victims and survivors of human trafficking?
Well, I mean, it's simply a call for Christians, because we are called to do good, to be a light into the world. And, this is an area of extreme darkness. If we can bring the light of Christ, it is the only disinfectant that really works. I get what you're saying, the aspect of it used to be considered, okay, yeah, brothels, and that seems very, very distant, especially in rural areas. But, many of these guys, it's massage parlors, strip clubs, bars, truck stops. I mean, it is just in everywhere that you pass by, because it is so common in so many places that you just don't think about it. But even in some private homes and stuff where there's trafficking taking place, it is surprising. But yeah, mercy and compassion. One of the passages I think is very good, and it was in that audio CD that I had, and that rebuke the oppressor. One of the passages that Ben Ginolo had mentioned was Isaiah 1:17, which I think was just fantastic. And it's learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause. I mean, man, that just really brings it home on what we're called to do. We're not called to just know that there's bad out there, that there's bad going on. We're called to do something. James, faith without works. Hey, get off your feet, get out of your comfort zone and go and try to do something. And what that doing is going to look different for everyone in every situation, but we can all do something, and we are called to do something. Wilberforce from Great Britain, he was one of the instrumental figures of stamping out the slave trade in the UK years ago. And his quote, I can't remember it exactly, but it's, you may choose not to do something, but you can never again say that you did not know. It's something along those lines. And it's when you've heard, when you've learned that there's something going on, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to just sit there, or are you going to actually do something? And it's just a call to do something. And of course, that's not just with trafficking. That's an area that has been close to my heart since I heard that audio CD. But whatever it is, wherever you see injustice and oppression and darkness, it is our opportunity. It is our obligation. It is our privilege and honor to take the light of Christ to those places. It's very easy to take the light of Christ in a well-lit place with a lot of other believers. But, that's true for a lot of other believers. They're already there. We're called to the dark places, and that's where we should go.
Let's kind of take the veil off for a minute of what that darkness might look like. We've kind of, not meaning to, but skirted around the issue itself. Can you more clearly define what human trafficking is, and
Sure.
what it could even look like or mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's your official definitions that talk about, a commercial sex act that takes place. And the three main words that are used in that are force, fraud, and coercion. So if those aspects are involved in this commercial sex act, that is considered human trafficking. Of course, that's different from human smuggling. Smuggling actually involves being transported. Trafficking, you don't actually have to be transported. It's one of those weird things. It's like we park in a driveway and we drive in a parkway. Doesn't really make sense. So you can be stationary and trafficked, and you can move around and be smuggled. But force, fraud, and coercion are the big aspects that are used to define that, and that's for both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. As far as kind of getting into some of that, so many churches, they fail to want to get into this. And I think it's because of this feeling that this is just one of those things that is not talked about around, polite folk, or about Christian folk. And the problem is when we don't talk about it, that's when it festers. That's when it grows. That's when it rears its ugly head and is allowed to continue on. So we have to address those things. I had a group of folks in my last congregation in Houston, and we were starting to talk about the issues of trafficking and how we could respond. And there was a district representative there, Dr. John Brown-Reuter, and he said, how do you get congregations? How do you get beyond the ick factor? And the answer was very simple. You start talking about it. You don't give the adversary the benefit of hiding in the shadows. By bringing it out into the light, you remove a lot of the power that is there. And the fact of the matter is, when you start really talking about the issues, even some of the ick factor issues, it gets less icky and easier to talk about. Well, maybe not less icky, but it's easier to talk about. It's easier to address. The more you address it, the easier it is. And so, I encourage you, maybe you start by talking with just a small group of folks at the church. That's maybe a group that's kind of dedicated to this, and then break out. But the fact is, you can get involved. Congregations and congregates can get involved in this issue without even touching the ick factor issues. There are a lot of things that can be done to address the issue and bring that light of Christ that you don't have to feel bad about. I'll tell you one of the ways that we did that in my last place. We even had the full congregation get involved by producing what were called go bags. And that was through the Freedom Church Alliance here in Houston, which is a fantastic group of other churches getting together to fight this issue together. And they found that law enforcement, when they were picking up people for prostitution and these other victims, because they still had to process them as that, they were coming in their work clothes, shall we say. And they didn't have any dignity. So we produced we called a go bag that had a lot of items in it. It had hygiene items, it had clothing items, had deodorant, had phone numbers for help, and those were put on little lipstick items. And instead of a barcode, it looked like a barcode, but it was actually a phone number. So we could hand those out to different people, and they could have a number to call to be rescued if they came into trouble without their traffickers knowing. But we packed these and gathered these bags together and gave them to law enforcement to give to the victims, because law enforcement didn't have the funds to be able to do that. Another case was we took our 7th and 8th graders at the school needed some avenues for service events. So one of the agencies that did frontline work and had a rescue house, they had some new facilities that needed a whole lot of grounds work. Well, the kids didn't need to know all of the details, but they knew that we could go and help prepare these grounds and help, clear leaves and mow and, do all of this other stuff that was beneficial, that didn't get into any of those ick factor issues. And I think when you start looking around, you can be very creative in finding a lot of avenues like that.
That's really impressive list for a congregation to already be involved in and seeking to care for victims and survivors of human trafficking. What are some other ideas that congregations, say my congregation, I'm not in Houston, Texas, I'm not in such a large city.
Sure.
But what about, rural Arkansas? You had
Yeah.
mentioned, really, I mean, these venues for human trafficking could be truck stops, massage parlors.
Hmm.
I've heard of nail salons as well. So, I
Hmm.
mean, certainly even my little town has those sites. So, what could I be aware of living in a rural area? And then what could my rural church possibly do about it to get involved?
Sure. I think the first thing that you can do is find out what your area needs. Talk to your law enforcement agencies. Talk to your social service agencies in your area, because they're going to have more of their hand and fingers on the pulse of their community to know what is going on and what is needed. And those needs are going to be very different in every single situation. But here's a couple of ideas regardless of your situation. Teach your kids, teach your youth, talk to your adults about pornography. I mean, that being one of the root issues, huge root issues, but actually talk about it and get it. It is a sad statistic of how many, not just of our youth, but of our adults are caught in that aspect of pornography. And that's true in the church. That's true even of pastors. Now, there are huge numbers. And that's another thing that just fuels that aspect of trafficking. And we can get more into how that fuels trafficking at some point. There's a great book called The Fight for Freedom. It's put out by the Freedom Church Alliance that I mentioned earlier. And it has not just a lot of information and interviews and stuff about some of these different areas, but it also gives some ideas on what are some next steps. So it will go through a different section on this avenue of trafficking, or this branch of trafficking, if you will. Give some interviews, and then it'll say, here are some steps that you can take in that area that might be helpful. If there are rescue homes, these are be probably more for urban areas, but if there are rescue homes, ask what they need. Maybe sponsor a room for some of the girls where you're providing, bedding, clothing, whatever, gifts to those who are rescued. Maybe there are people who need some basic necessities, basic needs in a city that is, like in our situation, we're 40 miles from Houston, but there might be some folks in Houston that need some clothes, some dignity items provided, that we can provide those and ship them over to them. Engaging in some of those periphery issues, not just pornography, but foster care. The foster care system, this was an old statistic. I don't know if it still holds true, but it was something like 80+% of those who have touched the foster care system in one way or another. And that's a very broad term. But all of those who have been trafficked had touched the foster care system, like 80% of them.
Wow.
It's a phenomenal number, which means that, if we as congregations, if you don't know of any trafficking things going on, maybe you know someone who can foster in your congregation, maybe someone who is fostering, has fostered, and you can come alongside and help them in positive ways where that person who has been in the foster system in your environment doesn't end up in the trafficking situation. Or in our case, my involvement has changed drastically since I moved from Houston to Sealy. We have a fantastic pregnancy center that is literally right next door. I'm looking out my window at it right now. And that's because you have many who are coming in who either may be trafficked or are in danger of being trafficked, or who are at greater risk of trafficking others in the future. So if you can be that positive influence, if you can pour Christ and his love and mercy into these people, into these situations, then you're helping to make sure that trafficking doesn't come out in the future. It's a preventive aspect. And those are things that I think all of us have access to in one way or another in all of our situations. We have some aspects where if we are pouring Christ into ones and they see the love of Christ, then it is less likely that trafficking will affect them in the future. But really, I'd say first talk to your law enforcement, talk to social agencies in your area see what you can do in that area. Not, it used to be the case, everyone wanted to, go out and do street evangelism or address those who are being trafficked on the street or whatever, and rescue the girls, and you can feel good about yourself, and and the fact of the matter is that's necessary, but there are a whole lot of other ways to get involved, and it may not be as glamorous, for lack of a better word, but it's effective and it's necessary. And if we can just find what lane has God given me in this area that I can go down and I can be that light of Christ in my context, in my situation. Don't think that if I'm not doing this, then that's not really helping, or that's not as good, or that, no. Do what you can, what God has given in your area for your people, in your community.
It also sounds like this is very much where vocation ties into it. Being the one who actually physically rescues a victim of human trafficking sounds like it's very dangerous and probably best suited for people who are trained in such interventions like law enforcement or other organizations who specifically do that kind of work. And these are some really helpful ideas for people who feel called to help in this way, feel the pull to really be involved in their community in this way. But as you had said, there's so much that intersects with human trafficking and various arteries flowing out of this and into this, that there are a lot of ways to be involved in what I would consider this as being a pro-life cause that is, rescuing people from human trafficking. And such ideas include being involved in your local pregnancy center, pouring into foster families as a congregation. So thank you for providing those ideas as well. If we can maybe further dive into, because you've touched on all of these, but further dive into what you believe to be some of the root causes or some of the issues that are stoking the fire for human trafficking. You mentioned pornography, you mentioned foster care, and then also the issue of abortion is involved in this, I'm sure, in a number of ways. So can you kind of share what could be some of the root causes leading to human trafficking, and then also some of the issues that come out of this that we might not realize?
Yeah, I think porn is going to be the big dog in any of that. But yeah, foster care, abortion has its head raised, and many times where you'll have someone who's trafficked or prostituted when they get pregnant, insisting by the trafficker or their pimp to get an abortion. So that you see that rearing its head many times. But I also think that kind of our cultural situation that has changed, and part of it since COVID, and part of it because of more leftist ideologies, has a fear of relationships, that I don't know how to approach a girl and ask her out and stuff, for fear that I might say the wrong thing, touch the wrong area, do the wrong, whatever, and that I might be canceled, I might be prosecuted and litigated, whatever. And so that turns others into some more online situations. And it gets back to porn, and that porn aspect, it, like any addiction, feeds on itself and gets further and further radicalized. So it's not the lack of a better way, it's not the pornography that your grandparents had, right? It's not the Playboy and stuff in the magazine. Not saying that's good. That's sin too. That's bad. But it has gotten so much more violent, radicalized, criminal, where you have one of the largest industrial commercialized aspects is a criminalized one in Pornhub, and and so many of the other ones that have it, where people can upload their sex acts without consent, without age verification, without anything. And so there are the amount of child pornography, amount of assault and things that are going on there, and of people who are trafficked. They are engaged in these commercialized sex acts through force, fraud, coercion, or in case of a minor. Now those things don't even apply. It's just it's illegal, straight out, and it gets worse and worse. So because you always want something novel, something new. So what satisfied you at one point doesn't, and so it gets worse. And you have these commercial ventures that try to tailor to that. And so everything under the sun is out there. And those folks it's not like most of that content isn't like, all right, you have a couple that are consensual and they both say, hey, let's film this, let's upload it, and won't that be fun? That's not what's happening. It is almost always someone who is shown against their will. It may not seem that way even on camera, and I hope no one knows what it looks like on camera, because that means that you're involved in this, and don't do that. But they're not. It is something that has become more pervasive. Like I say, since COVID, when everything was moving online, when people were isolated, it got even more so like this. And you can even tell there was an app that you could download. I forget what it's called now. But if you were at hotels, you could take a picture of the room in a couple of different angles, and it would upload to this database. And I didn't know this, but many, especially your chain ones, will have like the same layout, as the same like fabrics and look per floor of their hotel. So they were able to use these to track down, in a lot of cases, where if they saw a video of someone and they suspected trafficking, they could use these pictures and say, oh, that's the same bedspread that's here, and the curtains and everything else. So they could narrow down where that was actually possibly taking place. Kind of amazing and frightening at the same time. And I've kind of gone off the end here, but all of those are avenues that touch that system. And of course, there's more, I'm sure, that I don't know about, but those are the most prevalent.
Is there a way that I may innocently, unknowingly be fueling the market for human trafficking without knowing it? I'm even thinking too, aside from pornography, as I had learned at my one MOPS session I went to, where, places like nail salons or massage places could be venues for human trafficking, or where victims of human trafficking work. And, is there something in our conscience as Christians that we should be asking ourselves before we go someplace like that? Is do I think this place is vetted or secure? Or
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know the best answer for that, because obviously not all massage parlors, not all bars, are places where this happens. And I'm sure it's got to be very frustrating for some legitimate folks who work at legitimate places to be tied to these things, at least peripherally. I'm not sure how you do that. That's a very good question. I do remember one time I was going with a friend to a cigar shop, and right next door was a massage place, and it had blacked out, the windows and stuff like that. And I was thinking, it just had all those signs, those red flags that was. So I took the phone number on there, and I did some deep searching on it, and it came back with some things that, this is a place that caters to that. They have actually advertised this phone number in areas that this takes place. And for many, they would never know that. You go in and you get your massage or nails or whatever, and you wouldn't know. How do you vet those things? I'm not sure what the best answer to that is, Steph. I don't know that's that's beyond my capabilities at this point. I will say it was interesting. You talked about street rescuing, stuff like that. There's actually been a lot of that by one of the groups called Elijah Rising here in the Houston area. And they are kind of the grandfather agency in Houston. They have put their fingers and hands in just about every aspect. And they're like, hey, if there's trafficking going on here, we're going to try to tackle it no matter what. So they've done those. And their solution isn't, to try to rescue. But like I say, they have things like compacts and lipsticks that have hidden phone numbers and stuff on them to hand out. So they just go up and say, hey, praying for you and stuff like that, and just work up a relationship and hand things like that. They did strip club ministry and outreach. I did that once with some folks, and the way that they do that is they have one man and two women on the team. The man drives them there, has his phone in the parking lot in case something goes wrong, and prays. While the two ladies, they take cookies in and talk to the ladies who are performing, and they just strike up a conversation, say, hey, we know this is you're in a rough spot and stuff, and we just want you to know that you're loved and prayed for, and we make these cookies for you. I mean, it was really very sweet. That's certainly not for everyone.
So how does a place like Elijah Rising actually rescue victims of human trafficking? How does that practically play out?
Well, they have people who they route those to people who can actually go and pick up, and then they are taken to a safe place, safe house type of situation. And then it's seen what other places do rescue work in that area, or maybe outside of that area. So there's several agencies that do that frontline work here. Elijah Rising being one of them. They have a couple of safe houses that are kind of outside the Houston area, and they don't obviously publicize where that is. But we've done some work there. It's interesting that is a very specific type of calling too. Those who do work with those who are rescued, some of them talk about the 3 or the 4 month wall, where when you're trafficked and abused so much, you get kind of this tunnel vision, and you dissociate yourself from the person who's getting abused. A defense mechanism. You kind of withdraw into yourself. And as these who are rescued, as they start having therapy and talking about these things, they have to start addressing that. They have to start coming back and addressing that pain. And for some, when that's around 3 or 4 months, they hit this wall and it's just too much for them, and they revert back and leave. But, if they can make it past that, they have a much greater shot at being able to continue on beyond that.
Pastor, as a subject matter expert in proclaiming the gospel, how does the gospel speak into this issue, and where is the hope of Christ in the midst of all of this?
Well, I think there's several passages that kind of lead me. The one was that one from Isaiah that I had said. Another is from Proverbs 3:27. Don't withhold good when it's in your power to do so. That aspect of, if you look at someone lustfully in Matthew 5:28, you're committing. But that whole aspect of the fact is, all of us were in bondage to sin. All of us still struggle with sin. None of us can cast that first stone. And Christ has freed us with his mighty hand and outstretched arm. He has freed us continually, made real for us through the cross and the empty tomb. And if that has been the reality given freely to us, how can we not want desperately to share that freedom, to share that lack of oppression and that grace and that mercy and with those who are going through some situations that are far beyond our darkest comprehensions? If we can be ones who can take the lamp of the word of Christ, let us do it. Let us be that body of Christ to others, because the fact of the matter is, they are created in the image of God too. The Imago Dei applies to them. We try to take a look and we either, there are some that look at those who are trapped either in disdain how dare they, or as if, it's a victim shaming type of thing, or it's just oh, that is really too bad. And I feel sorry for them, and okay, I'll pray for them, which I hope you do. But they are created in the image of God. These are fellow people for whom Christ loves and for whom he died. Let's treat them as such. Let's talk to them as such. Let's address them as such. Let's try to let them have the blessings that we have in Christ. Let them know the salvation that is theirs in Christ. That's really what it's all about. I mean, it's one thing to be able to correct oppressors and do those things in this side of eternity, but how much better to share Christ and have them on the other side of eternity with us.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Pastor, thank you so much for taking time to join me today and to share all that you have with our listeners. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to have you as a guest.
Been a pleasure being here. Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. If you liked what you heard, please leave us a review and don't forget to click the follow or subscribe button so you don't miss out on upcoming episodes. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at LCMS Life. And finally, listeners, we want to hear from you. Do you have an idea about a guest you'd like to hear from or a topic you want talked about? Email us at friendsforlife@lcms.org. We want to hear from you about what you want to hear about when it comes to issues of life.
Thanks for joining us. Friends for Life is a podcast that discusses the life God has given and the people he has called you to serve, right where you are in God's mission.